Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer where we are taking a deep dive into a film that, on the surface, might just look like your standard run-of-the-mill action thriller, but it is actually something much, much deeper. We're breaking down the film Apex, starring Charlize Theron, and we're going to decode it not just as a really suspenseful cinematic experience, but as a profoundly deep psychological journey. What we're really looking at here is a classic story of what the famous psychologist Carl Jung called individuation, which is basically the ultimate human quest to become a complete whole person. So today, we're going to see exactly how this modern gritty thriller maps just perfectly onto ancient mythological structures.
So here is the big question. How does trauma actually become a strength? It's a pretty heavy question, isn't it? In Apex, our main character Sasha goes through an extreme, terrifying, and deeply cinematic trauma. But the absolute beauty of looking at the film through this lens is that her crazy physical ordeal is really just a huge magnification of the very real, very human inner struggles that all of us face. I mean, we've all experienced failures, or guilt, or those awful moments that completely shatter our sense of who we are, right? The question we're going to answer, using Sasha's crazy journey as our guide, is how we can take those exact moments that break us and actually use them to build an entirely new, stronger foundation.
Now, to really understand this journey, we first have to wrap our heads around Carl Jung's concept of the shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is basically the hidden, repressed, and often really dark aspect of ourselves. It's born from our guilt, our perceived failures, our destructive aggression, basically all the stuff we desperately push down and refuse to look at. And here's the kicker. Everyone has a shadow. Everyone. When we refuse to integrate it, when we just try to ignore our guilt or pretend our failures didn't happen, that shadow doesn't just magically disappear. Oh no, it acts out, and usually in really destructive ways. And as we're going to see, Sasha's entire arc in this movie is a literal flesh and blood battle with her own shadow.
So, let's start at the beginning of that arc, with the total collapse of the ego.
Let's walk through how this builds across Sasha's incredibly tragic timeline. Step 1 takes us to the terrifyingly sheer cliffs of the Troll Wall in Norway. Sasha's entire identity, what psychologists would call her persona, is totally built around being this highly competent, fearless, adventurous climber. But then, a massive storm hits the wall, and she experiences the ultimate ego failure. To save her own life, she literally has to cut the rope of her climbing partner Tommy, sending him falling to his death. In that split second, her entire identity just shatters. Fast forward to step 2, 5 months later, and we see the grim aftermath, deep depressive isolation. All that guilt has festered into an unintegrated shadow, which then brings us to step 3. Sasha travels out to the incredibly remote Wanderara National Park in Australia. But make no mistake, this is not a vacation to clear her head. She is actively seeking the end.
And this is exactly what brings us to the call of the unconscious.
Unintegrated guilt becomes self-destruction. It's a harsh truth. Because Sasha completely fails to mentally process the guilt of cutting Tommy's rope, her own psyche essentially forces a physical manifestation of that guilt. Seeking out the deadliest, most unforgiving wilderness is a textbook example of the call of the unconscious. Basically, if you absolutely refuse to face your shadow mentally, your mind will unconsciously steer you into a physical, real-world situation where you have literally no choice but to confront it. Sasha is walking into that Australian desert to be punished.
Which sets the perfect stage for the next phase, meeting the shadow face to face.
Enter Ben, played just brilliantly by Taron Egerton. Now, if you're just sitting on the couch watching this as a popcorn movie, Ben is just a really creepy psychopathic hunter and cannibal. But look at him through our psychological lens, and Ben is so much more. He is the literal breathing personification of Sasha's repressed shadow. Just look at his traits. He's this raw, archaic, violent force. He's a trickster who completely and utterly lacks human empathy. He ritualistically hunts and devours people. Ben sees Sasha as prey, sure, but the terrifying part is that he recognizes she secretly loves the danger. He is perfectly mirroring her own repressed death wish, as well as her own primitive survival instinct. He is exactly the monster she went into the desert to find.
And this is where the explainer hits a really fascinating connection, showing how deeply this thriller taps into ancient myth. Think about Ben, the modern psychopathic hunter, and compare him to Polyphemus, the man-eating one-eyed giant from Homer's Odyssey. The source material explicitly links these two figures. Just like Polyphemus, Ben represents the one-sided, primitive, totally blind force of the unconscious. He's entirely driven by base hunting instincts, completely blind to anything resembling human empathy. By anchoring this modern-day thriller villain to an ancient monstrous force from the Greek underworld, the film totally elevates Sasha's story from a simple survival flick into a full-blown mythic ordeal.
Now we plunge straight into the underworld, where we see the actual transformation of her guilt.
During the absolute climax of the hunt, when things are at their most desperate, Sasha finally has her psychological breakthrough. She realizes right then and there that cutting Tommy's rope on that wall in Norway was not a moral failure. It was a devastating but necessary act of self-preservation. This is the ultimate turning point of the entire movie. She shifts her mindset from this crippling, self-destructive guilt that's been slowly killing her to the stark, brutal, necessary reality of survival.
By changing her mindset, she changes her fate. Sasha ultimately defeats the savage Ben, using raw combat and sheer cunning. But here is the critical Jungian concept. You don't simply destroy the shadow. You can't. Instead, Sasha integrates it. She finally acknowledges the dark necessity of her own survival instinct. The savage dies, yeah, but his transforming power remains with her. Sasha absorbs that raw, primitive strength and that unyielding will to live, but crucially, she does it without being consumed by the madness herself. She took the darkness, faced it head-on, and used it to become a stronger person.
And that brings us to the triumphant return, the closing of this eternal mythic cycle. The film gives us this beautifully cathartic ending to wrap all of this up. We see Sasha scaling a brand new, incredibly treacherous rock face. But this time, it's different. She is alone, she is completely in control, and she does not fall. This climb isn't just about getting back to her hobby. It's the ultimate physical symbol of her expanded personality. Her ego isn't broken anymore. By integrating her shadow, she can now embrace the entire spectrum of her existence, both life and death, the guilt and the forgiveness. She returns to the real world not as the naive adventurer we met at the start, but as a complete, fully holistic woman.
So, while this movie might have a really pulpy, intense thriller exterior, its skeleton is pure ancient mythology. Step 1. The descent, the tragic fall from the mountain and her dark journey into the outback. Step 2. The confrontation, meeting her shadow in the terrifying form of the cannibalistic hunter. Step 3. The transformation, finally letting go of the guilt and accepting her right to survive. And Step 4. The ascent, climbing that new rock face entirely whole and integrated. It really is just a flawless modern execution of how trauma, when actively and bravely confronted, transforms into profound personal power.
Now, because these archetypal patterns are so universal to the human experience, they just constantly reappear in cinema. As noted in our source text, we've just decoded how Apex brilliantly channels these ancient Greek concepts. But it gets even better, because we are going to apply this exact same framework, decoding the original of all originals, when we tackle Christopher Nolan's highly anticipated Homer-inspired film Odyssey in a future explainer. You definitely won't want to miss seeing how Nolan interprets these exact same archetypal steps. It's going to be awesome. But before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought. We've watched Sasha battle her literal, physical demons out in the desert to integrate her guilt. But remember, the hero's journey isn't just for fictional characters on a movie screen. So I ask you, what shadow must you face to become whole? What unintegrated guilt or perceived failure is quietly driving your unconscious behaviors right now? Facing it might honestly feel like a descent into the underworld, but as we've learned today, it really is the only true path back up the mountain. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I will see you next time.